This is Digitizing Delmarva Heritage and Traditions. Well, hello, I'm Phil Tilghman, and this is a special occasion for us because once again we are asking our friend, Reverend Nathaniel Pierce, to talk about Christmas, the annual Christmas message. We did this for several years on one-on-one, and this is a special edition. Welcome.
Thank you. And you're coming out of retirement to do it, and I'm about to head off into retirement.
That's right. January of 2016 will be your last month at St. Philip's.
Yes. So it'll have been a total of, 14 years.
15 years, yeah. Somewhere around 2000 that it started.
2002, I think, is when we began.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Well, it's been a great run. And,
everybody.
And we have enjoyed these Christmas chats. So let's just talk about this as a Christmas chat, just you and I talking together. And you, during Advent this year, have been talking about the time as been the theme of the gospel lessons. How's that coming? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, whenever we have a season in the liturgical calendar, I find it helpful to read the scriptural passages for that season to see if there's a theme. And this year, as you know, we're on a 3-year cycle. This year, the theme of the gospel readings for Advent is time. That's what they all have in common. And time has been, time is something that I think we use the word glibly without ever really stopping to think about what it means and the different meanings it has in our life. We're very aware of it when we feel pressed for time. We're very aware of it when we're bored, as in a sermon.
Mm-hmm. Got too much time on my hands.
Too much time on my hands. But I think it helps every once in a while just to stop and put things into perspective and go back to the very beginning. And I'm talking in terms of the very beginning of the Big Bang.
Oh.
Way back when everything began.
A few billion years ago?
Many billion years ago. And the TV show Cosmos, Neil deGrasse Tyson, did a wonderful segment on time, and he compressed all of the time that we're aware of from the Big Bang to the present into a calendar year. Now I'm going to compress it for our conversation today into about 11 months. We're taping this on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, so we'll take the span from the Big Bang, which happens at midnight January 1, down to the present moment, December 7th, and look at the various benchmarks over that span of time in the universe. The first galaxies are created in about January 12. We have the Milky Way about March 10th. And our own sun, which of course sustains all of life on our planet, begins operation around August 15th. So you have 7.5 months from the Big Bang until we get the beginning of the sun. Life begins here on the planet Earth about September 15th. So now we're up to 8.5 months. Life that breathes and moves on its own, that begins around October 24th. The first flower on our planet, that happens about November 15th. The human beings first appear on the planet yesterday, December 6th. Moses and the great exodus from Egypt, that's 7 seconds ago, and Jesus, of course, was born 5 seconds ago. So all of that time between Jesus and the present moment is all of 5 seconds. Now, doesn't that put things in a whole different perspective?
It sure does. It's amazing.
It really sort of blows the mind. And we get so focused with the next hour or the next day, we totally forget about this long span of creation and development where the creative force was at work leading us to the present moment. We take it for granted, pay no attention to it whatsoever.
So what does that say about the importance of our role, your role and my role in the well, we're both 74, soon be 74.
73.
73. I'll be 74 next month.
I'll be 74 next August. Yep.
Okay. So in our 74 years, which is a millisecond.
Yes.
What impact have we had? We ask, when we get to a certain age, we ask ourselves, is this world a better place because I was here? Will anybody even know I was here 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or whatever?
Well, I think of life as this flowing river, and our job is to make a contribution to leave things a little bit better than what we found them. And as a minister in a church, I'd like to be able to look back at my ministry and say, is this church better, stronger than when I first arrived? Have we done some creative things? For example, at St. Philip's, we put in 5 new stained glass windows and bought a new organ and fixed up the graveyard and fixed up the buildings and held steady in terms of the number in the congregation, which in this day and age is quite an accomplishment.
Yeah.
So I say, thanks to all those who work together, I think we're leaving the church in a better place. I'd like to think we are making a contribution to the world. Our generation, of course, has given the world so many incredible inventions, from the computer and things like that, but I'm not sure the world is a better place. I think of the violence that's going on, particularly the mass shootings recently in San Bernardino and elsewhere, and I just wonder if we're a happier people and learned anything about living together.
Mm-hmm. Is the condition of the world today, does that make it more important to hear the message of Jesus?
Well, I think it's more important than ever to recognize God's presence in the creative process. And Jesus, of course, comes with that message that there is a God, that God cares about you. I think that's more important than ever. I'm afraid that as the Christmas season becomes more and more commercialized and fewer people go to church, we may lose that religious dimension to the Christmas message. But it's a wonderful opportunity to touch base with people, because a lot of people come to church on Christmas Eve that you normally don't see during the rest of the year. Mm-hmm. And I welcome that. I like to stay in touch with them, even if it's only on Christmas and Easter.
Yeah.
To touch base, and at some point their lives may bring them to the point where they want to come regularly, but better to see them twice a year than not at all.
Well, there's a lot of things that draw a lot of us to church, and tradition is probably one of the big things. If we grew up in the church, we feel comfortable in the church. We find comfort and a message there that is important to us.
I think it's another key aspect of it today is community. When you develop that sense of community in a church and you feel part of that, and you know that people care about you and you care about them, I don't know where I find that anywhere else in my life. I mean, I don't find it at Rotary or the Lions Club or even at a neighborhood association meeting.
No.
You really don't have that sense of, family and friends, maybe I feel a sense of community, but the wonderful thing about church is you you can't choose who the other people are.
Interestingly, the Diocese of Easton is going through a process of selecting the 11th bishop of the Diocese of Easton. And in that process, the discernment of all of the 38, whatever it is, congregations on the eastern shore of Maryland that make up the diocese, the input from all of this have said the status quo is not an option. So I guess I know we're looking for a shepherd to be our bishop who will force us gently or with force of personality or whatever skills it takes to make people change. And that's not unlike most churches when they're looking for a new rector. Certainly in the last 14 years, you've encouraged us many times to look at things differently than we had been inherently accustomed to. And so remark a little bit about the new presiding bishop of all of the Episcopal churches in the United States. Tell us a little bit about him.
Michael Curry, wonderful evangelical black preacher who was in Baltimore for 12 years before he became the Bishop of North Carolina. Wonderful evangelical spirit. He's the first black presiding bishop we've had, and he follows the first woman presiding bishop we've had. And we very much hope he will lead us. I'm reminded some years back when I interviewed for a parish, and they said to me, we're looking for a shepherd to lead us. And I said, well, do you have any sheep that want to be led?
Good question. I wonder what the answer was.
Well, we often use that language, but usually when we use that language, we're looking for a shepherd who will lead us in the direction that we already have decided we want to go.
Yeah.
And I don't think the shepherd forces us to change. I think we have to change because we decide we want to change.
Yeah. Well, I guess a very successful priest or a very successful bishop will encourage us to change and make us think it's our own idea. Maybe
that's kind of usually that's a brilliant sign of leadership. And the good leader, I think, discerns where the community is and what the next step is. The problem with leadership is you can't get too far ahead of people, or you lose them.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the next step in our personal and spiritual growth? And that's sort of a give and take. You discern that. It's a matter of discerning that. Hard to do. You're on the search committee, aren't you?
I am, yeah. And it's a very interesting process, really. We're in Advent, and you talked about time. Last week we talked about John the Baptist as part of the Advent season, heralding the coming of the Messiah, and you mentioned that you suspect that back in those times when John the Baptist was saying, hey, get ready, the Messiah is coming, I wonder how many people listened to him.
Well, for several reasons. First, there were probably a dozen or so people saying the Messiah is coming. So that kind of prophecy was a dime a dozen in first century Palestine. Secondly, we only value John the Baptist in hindsight. We look back and say he was right. He was the one who understood. But I don't think people knew that at the time at all. And if you look at our own time, the people who have seen something coming, you may remember in that sermon, I talked about the person who saw the economic collapse coming.
Sheila Bair,
president of Washington College now. And
then president of FDIC.
Yes, and no one listened to her. So sometimes it's really hard to be the John the Baptist in a situation because often you're telling people something they don't want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's really hard sometimes to break through that wall of denial, I think, and say to encourage people to open their eyes. I mean, we're fighting the same battle, I think, now with climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to grasp the danger that we are in and the catastrophe that will follow if we don't change our ways.
Well, reading the Gospels, as we do every Sunday and more often, hopefully, and Jesus uses parables to help people make that change from and recognize some things in themselves that maybe they say, oh, good golly, you know, that could be me that he's talking about.
I think it was absolute genius in the way he did that. He would tell a parable, a story, and on the surface it sounded sort of simple and mundane. But then if you go home and think about it and sort of peel back the layers of what he was saying, suddenly you discover the secret message that he was communicating. Favorite example of that is the story of the prodigal son. And everyone thinks it's about the son who went off and spent the family wealth and came back contrite and apologized to his father. And at first reading, that's what it seems all about, and what a wonderful story of how the father forgives him. But if you read it carefully and reflect on it, you suddenly discover that the story is really not about the prodigal son. It's about the older brother. And that's who we are in the story.
Yeah.
We can all feel good about the story of the prodigal son because we're not the wayward child that went off and spent all the money. But of course, that's why we are the older brother, because he's feeling that too, and can't come to the party. Absolutely marvelous moment. But Jesus had a way of hiding the real message in the story, so you don't get it first time you hear it. You have to.
What's the message in the Christmas story that you're going to talk about Christmas Eve?
What is the message in the Christmas story? Well, I always like to talk about there being no room in the inn. Is there room in the inn today? Whether the inn is our home or our hearts, or do we make room for the stranger who is traveling the road? And I think that question is put to us rather directly by the refugee crisis.
Yeah.
Do we have room at the inn for people who have fled hunger and violence and war and have nothing left but what they were able to carry? And given some of the rhetoric that's going on, I think a lot of people in the United States don't feel like this room. So that's always one important theme, I think, to lift up at the time of Christmas, is to welcome the stranger. What I'm going to preach on in particular this year is a disaster I lived through in my own life and what it taught me about Christmas.
Oh.
Has to do with Santa Claus. Santa Claus, by the way, is a wonderful representation of the Christmas spirit. So I don't see Santa Claus as an enemy. I see him as a friend, because Santa Claus gives you your present whether you deserve it or not.
And so does God.
So does God.
I see.
One thing I'm sad about in terms of Santa Claus, you know, he used to, when we saw a picture of Santa Claus, he was smoking a pipe.
And you smoke a pipe.
And I
course.
do.
Yeah.
And now
and
they
you
don't.
look a little bit like Santa Claus.
But well, I'm letting the beard grow a little bit longer. You may have noticed that. But Santa Claus doesn't smoke the pipe anymore, and I think that's too bad. You know who's responsible for our image of Santa Claus? Who did the initial drawing that still is around today?
No.
Coca-Cola Company.
Wow.
So give thanks for Coca-Cola for at least doing something right.
They used Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell was oftentimes the artist who's used, well, I'll be darned. So we have Coca-Cola to thank for that.
We do.
Yeah.
Their soft drinks may be awful, but their picture of Santa Claus is really nice.
Well, you talked about the prodigal son and the older brother, And I know several years you have preached and say, let's look at the Christmas story from a different perspective, from Joseph's perspective, or from the shepherd's perspective, or the wise men, or what have you. And there's a story there and a message there.
Yeah, and that's the beautiful thing about the biblical story, is that you can glean a meaning from it if you put yourself in each character's role. The shepherds who come in from the fields to give thanks for the birth of the Christ child, the lowest people on the totem pole in terms of the society of those days. Mm-hmm. It would be like saying the homeless person on the street came in and gave thanks. And Joseph, who must be puzzled about what's going on, and Mary, I put that on my Christmas card. The first Christmas begins with a yes from a poor peasant pregnant girl in Galilee.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe Christmas can begin with our yes. And the angels and the wise men. The wonderful thing about the wise men is that they go home a different way.
They're changed.
They're changed.
Yes.
But they don't get, a bishop doesn't tell them to go home a different way. They decide to go home a different way.
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah. But the bishop has to help us. Well, what is the role of bishop?
That's a good question, particularly in this day and age. What is the role of the bishop? I think first and foremost to preach the gospel, and secondly, to tell us to speak the truth in love, even when it's something we don't want to hear. Mm-hmm. I think today, what I look for in a bishop is someone who can communicate tough love. Communicate to us that he or she, and it may be a she this time, he or she cares, but here's the truth. Here's what's going on. And we're in it together, and let's work on this together. And thirdly, I hope there'll be a touch of the prophetic word in the new bishop, someone who is indeed one step ahead of us, saying, mm-hmm. Come on.
Who challenges us.
Challenges us, exactly. Who's not here simply to
make us feel
put in
good.
The last 10 years of his or her ministry and retire.
Yeah, yeah. Well, priests in the Episcopal Church, are there plenty of new priests being ordained?
Yes.
And are they younger?
Some of them, yes. In fact, I saw a study some years ago that, the membership of the Episcopal Church is going down, and the number of ordained people is going up. And someone plotted the two graphs and figured out by 2050 we would have at least one priest for every Episcopalian left.
Well, we're laughing, but that's not a
reason,
very pretty picture.
The vocation of when I went to seminary in 1968, it was not a popular vocation. There were campaigns recruiting young people to think of the ministry. Today, it's remarkable. In the Episcopal Church, now this isn't true of the Roman Catholics. They're having a horrible time. But in the Episcopal Church, we have more clergy than we know what to do with. Not so much here on the Eastern Shore. I, quote unquote, retired in 2003, but for the last 12 years, as you know, I've been extraordinarily busy.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I think our generation is doing, to go back to your earlier question, is we are rewriting what it means to be retired. When our parents retired, they bought the place in Florida and played golf 5 or 6 days a week. Mm-hmm. But most of us have ministries and projects that we're involved in and still work on them.
Well, the one thing that's also true of all those people who moved to Florida, they want to be busy. They also want to feel like their life has meaning, that they're contributing, that they're doing something. So the state of Florida is full of volunteers, whether it's with the arts or with a church or whatever whatever it is, the people want to feel busy and engaged, and that's true whether you retire at where you've always lived or whether you move to Florida or Arizona. It doesn't make much difference, I think. But well, go ahead.
And more we're seeing baby boomers who choose to stay in their home, whereas, and this is driving the whole retirement community. The retirement communities that hope retired people will move in, they're having a horrible time keeping their places full.
Oh, well, they advertise enough.
Oh, yes.
To people like me.
Oh, yes.
And you.
Once a week, I get something in the mail.
Oh, yeah. Make you look, oh, my land. Go here and you can paint and play croquet all day long and just have a great time. Well, we're talking about people our age. How is it that we go about making the message of Christmas, and more importantly, probably the message of Easter, relevant to the young 20, 30, 40-year-olds?
I think the most important thing we can do is to live it. And if we're living that reality, I think that's what eventually changes people when they're ready to hear the message.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful saying, let me see if I can remember it, that's attributed to St. Francis. At all times, preach the gospel. If necessary, use words.
That is very profound.
Isn't that a great saying?
That is great. At all times, preach the gospel. If necessary, use words. That's terrific. One of the people we interviewed on when I had one-on-one was Arnold Beanstalk, the rabbi.
Yes.
Who I know you're a friend of yours, and who's taught the book of Matthew in college, and a very learned individual. And we talked about the same thing, how to make the message that he's delivering relevant. His congregation at the synagogue is primarily older people who, for some reason, either tradition or what have you, feel comfortable in that community, as you say, in that setting where they feel good about. I feel good after going to church on Sunday. Carol and I go almost every Sunday, and so it's uplifting, and I particularly look forward to Christmas Eve, because you always have a really neat message on Christmas Eve. So I'm going to look forward to that this year, and of course the music has something to do with it.
Oh yes.
Because it's St. Philip's.
We're going to have a soloist this year.
I heard, yes. I know her, and I know that we'll be very pleased with that soloist and our new organ. And
let me go back to Arnie for a minute. What the Christian and Jewish faith try and teach people isn't that different? Very similar. The thing that we have to work on is to recover the fact that there are three great religions that descended from Abraham. There's Christians, there's the Jewish, and the Muslims.
Yeah.
And we have Abraham in common, and we have lost that. The animosity that we feel towards the Muslim community today is
it's based
really
on fear.
Yes.
It's based on fear.
Yes.
And it's not here's the Muslim community, and I don't know what percentage of those who are, have the jihadist, the ideas of destroying anybody else who's not Muslim. But
well, they're taking a page, of course, out of Christian history.
Wow, the Crusades.
Crusades, yes.
Yeah.
If you weren't Christian, you got put to death to spare you that extra time in purgatory. So, and that's where we were 1,000 years ago.
Yeah. I think it's worth repeating as the last thing we say today, the words that you just spoke about preaching the gospel. Let's say that one more time, please.
At all times, preach the gospel. If necessary, use words.
Father Pierce, thank you for being with us again. I look forward to this. I don't know what we're going to do next year. Maybe you and I will just meet and have lunch sometime, and we'll talk. Okay.
And we'll have our walkers probably by then.
And this gives us a nice opportunity to say to all the people who watch Pack 14, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, great season coming up. Thank you for being with us.